Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and welcome onto the show a guest who is a Vikings fan and has just released his Why Your Team Sucks about the Minnesota Vikings on Defector. Drew Magary making his first ever appearance on the show, though we have chatted many, many times about the Minnesota Vikings. How are you, Drew? Thanks for coming on, buddy.
This is 100% honest. There's nobody I like chatting about the Vikings with than you. Like every time I text you, like, oh, motherfucker, like Garrett Bradbury's still here. It's like you're the best person to text that to. Probably against your best interest, but I do enjoy it quite a bit.
Well, I appreciate that. Here's what I want to talk about real quick is before I ask you what you're interested in with this team, because it has been the quietest camp that I've covered, which is I keep trying to tempt the gods to change that, but they haven't so far. Can we reflect a little bit on your roller coaster of emotions during the Jim Harbaugh era as Minnesota Vikings coach? Because when we talk about, the conversations we were having as that was going on, I feel like you sort of got all in on that idea, and then we're quickly off that train and all in on the Kevin O'Connell train. That was quite a time in our lives that we haven't really reflected on a whole lot.
Well, after Zimmer got fired, I got like a tip from someone else, not you, but they were looking at Harbaugh. This was back when like there were rumors that they were looking like sniffing around like Lane Kiffin, and everyone was like, "Oh, holy shit!" But then I got the Harbaugh tip, which I could not corroborate, but obviously ended up becoming a public enemy anyway. And I had always thought, I don't actually believe this now for various reasons, but I had thought that Harbaugh belonged back in the NFL, that he really wasn't. I think he had proven a not terribly good fit for Michigan, even though he had made the playoff this past season. And I still believe that he was a very good NFL coach, someone who would just by sheer force of will get you to win 10 plus games every year. So I was excited at that prospect. And, as we got closer and closer to it, if you're a fan, one of the fun things to do is to talk yourself into these things, right? Like you always get taunted after the fact when it doesn't work out. Like, oh, you talked yourself into, you sucker. Like it's always portrayed as sort of suckerdom, particularly with this team, right? But, that daydreaming is part of is part of the enjoyment of football, because really otherwise, I should have abandoned the Vikings long ago, but I didn't, because, investing your hopes into certain things, even when they fail, is still worth it on a straight, on a sort of morbid level. So I wanted Harbaugh. I was thinking that he could do the same with us that he did in San Francisco. And I also thought maybe he'd be the one person with enough juice and enough authority to get rid of Kirk Cousins and just start all over again. And of course, that didn't happen. And it was interesting to me when Chad Graff, who covers the Pats now at The Athletic, but he covered the Vikings for a while. And he said, the day that they brought in Harbaugh, the day that everyone figured they were going to ink a deal because he had essentially said goodbye to Michigan that day. But at around 3 p.m., something happened, and everything went sour between him and the Vikings, and then they ended up with Kevin O'Connell, at midnight that night. So, I have every reason to believe that somehow Kirk Cousins' name was invoked at that hour. And, I think I was despondent that I had, sort of already sort of laid out my own, existential red carpet for Harbaugh to come here. And that, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensa would get his guy, and that it would, there would be sort of a plan in place. And, with O'Connell's hiring, it very much seemed like a second choice. I think it still does. I think that they ultimately hired the right person, especially now that Harbaugh's been sort of exposed as a complete raving MAGA loon, right? But it still strikes me that this team, because of the mandate that Kwesi was given by ownership to be competitive while rebuilding, so he had to say they're in a competitive rebuild, which doesn't mean anything, right? I'm still not confident I know who is running the ship there. And whoever is, I don't think necessarily has a unified plan. I think Adolfo-Mensa, has opinions and he wants to act on them. I don't believe that he has been given really the authority yet to do so. And so that I have to hope that somehow, however, the next season plays out, it plays out in a way that convinces the Wilfs that they need to give him freer reign over this roster. And I do think that could happen, but again, I'm doing that thing where I'm deluding myself, because I think deluding myself is the fun part.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. I mean, that's a consistent bit on this show, is when I have guests talk me into stuff that normally you wouldn't be able to reason yourself toward. But yeah, that space right there that you just talked about is one of the hardest things that this team is going to have to deal with, which is that the right long-term plan is probably after this season to make some serious changes, specifically at the quarterback position, unless it's like a 13-win season and O'Connell and Kirk are just the next, I don't know, Shanahan and Matt Ryan or something, and they go to the Super Bowl. But like, if that is not the case, and it feels much more like a Sean McVay, Jared Goff, where you can try to get the most out of him, but you probably need a little more there, or even a Kyle Shanahan and Jimmy Garoppolo, where they decided they needed a little more there. But you also don't want to see the team have a terrible season that sets you up for that high draft pick quarterback, because that means their entire decision failed to bring everybody back. So it's like, you want it to be good enough, but also for them to live in reality about what the future is.
Yeah, I as a fan, I don't like. I like the idea of tanking, but living through a 3-win season really, really sucks. Like, it's just unpleasant. And I'll never spend a 3-win season, every week being like, well, this is for the best. Like, every time I watch them get their ruined, by 30 points by Aaron Rodgers or whatever. Like, it's just not fun. The problem is, I have to suspect that they have a plan for after this season, but then it makes me, it baffles me that they did a lot of maneuvering this offseason that hampered their ability to do that. They added, bullshit years onto Thielen's contract. They added bullshit years onto Harrison Smith's contract. They gave Kirk a no trade clause, which still don't really know the parameters of it, or at least, according to you, and I trust you on that. So I don't know what their flexibility is going to be. I just know that there will be a little bit less of it in order to retain, to run it back this season with a team that has lost 9 games 2 straight years. So, that is where your confidence erodes, because, you want to believe that they're on the verge of doing something sort of earth-shattering, and that there will be a sea change within the personnel that reflects a sea change in leadership. But, they've sort of, cut out some of their avenues for doing that. I could be completely wrong. Quasi could be a genius and, get his way out of all that, this coming off season anyway. Or they could be good. Like, they have a relatively easy schedule. And I do think O'Connell will end up being a good coach. There's nothing he has done so far, at least outside of personnel, that I can really argue with, in terms of, making sure that he's not practicing the starters too hard, making sure that Justin Jefferson gets the ball all the time. Like his approach to, like, he doesn't yell at players, like the way Zim did every 5 seconds, like all of that. I think he is the correct sort of modern coach. Like, I think there's a strain of coach now, thanks to Sean McVay. I think Sean McVay is sort of the exemplar of it, but I think there are others like him, like Kyle Shanahan, that just don't coach the way that coaches used to coach. And I think that the entire profession will move toward what McVay and what O'Connell are doing. And I'm glad that we hopped onto that train, but I'm not confident right now that all of this is going to go smoothly. I think that there's going to be some unpleasantries between now and whenever O'Connell realizes his potential, if he ever does.
Right. And judging both of them right now is kind of a hard thing to do when everything sort of points to it wasn't their idea necessarily to go this direction. We're not entirely sure, but it seems like it. And even when I asked Mark Wilf directly, like, how much were you involved in this? And he said a lot. As far as wanting to be competitive. And so I think it was pretty clear that the ownership did not want to take this huge step back. And it's hard to do also with Justin Jefferson on your team. It's really hard to but as you brought up, when you make these decisions that sort of lock you into things for more than 1 year, it's not just a short-term competitive rebuild. It's actually in 2023, Adam Thielen's still making $19 million on the cap. And with O'Connell, Don't you think now you brilliantly write about bad coaching often throughout your career? I think it's about for O'Connell getting through this first training camp and off season with just not stepping on his own feet. If you go through this without making a complete buffoon of yourself, you've gone past like half of the coaches who ever get hired who are like having guys run gassers or doing up downs or just saying crazy things, or in Matt Patricia's case, lying to your ownership really from day one before you were even hired. Like, he's like guiding through a quiet training camp is actually quite the accomplishment for a head coach.
Yeah, and he's not unlike Brandon Staley, where he approaches sort of how he thinks about the game correctly, and then also finally and I think every team will do this soon. He has game management staff on hand in terms of analytics and in terms of in game situations, and I know that Spielman and Zimmer said that they had a little bit of that, but that was never evident when they were doing their job. There was no manifestation of that. It always looked like they didn't know what the they were doing when there were 2 minutes left in the game, particularly on defense. And that was especially true last year. And so it's, I think there are a lot of sort of foundational comforts to be had with O'Connell right now. But you're exactly right where, if I see Adolfo Mensa trashing Kirk accurately to USA Today, and yet he had to extend the guy for 2 years and give him a no trade clause. Well, all right. Who's running this team? Is it Kirk Cousins? Like, that's not good. Like, what I need some assurances that the guy we hired, who is allegedly quite smart and who will not hesitate to tell you he's a smart guy, can do his smart things instead of just sort of constantly running into roadblocks everywhere. I'll give him a grace period because it's his first time doing this job, but like I said, he's supposed to be very, very smart, and I believe he's smart. But then there's also times when Kwesi is talking in the press conferences and he comes off like every other tech bro you've ever heard speak, who sounds a little bit human, but you're not exactly sure of the motivation behind it.
No, I had the same impression. And even my first impression of Kwesi at the podium was like, I think that he is maybe underestimating how hard all of this is, maybe a little naivety there. And that kind of hit him in the face with the USA Today article, where it's like, yeah, if you talk about your quarterback being good and not great, and the great quarterbacks winning the Super Bowl, people are going to draw conclusions about that, my friend. I mean, because you're the GM of a team. So
and he was right. He was right.
Of course he's right.
He was 1,000% right about Kirk. And I don't give a shit how Kirk feels about it. I certainly don't care if it offended him.
No, I feel the same way. I mean, at this point, they've made it very clear that Kirk is the short-term option anyway, unless something really vastly changes. So there's a part of me that says that Adolfo Mensa gets it. It kind of gets where you're at. But then how much freedom does he have to do all the things that he wants to do? And maybe some of that even included Jim Harbaugh. I'm not sure. But I thought the Jim Harbaugh thing was highly questionable, that you would want to bring him back, because in my mind, you have to hand over the keys of your entire franchise to him. So maybe Kwesi was bailed out a little bit by the fact that didn't work out for whatever reason. But I think that what's hard from my perspective, Drew, is just how do you judge Kwesi's moves? Aside from did it work or not, and then you have to judge the entire organization and not just him. But I think we're used to just putting it all on a GM and being like, Spielman, he made that, he did this or he did that. It was Spielman's direction and so forth. But maybe even in some cases, it wasn't entirely his direction, but we just didn't understand that until this offseason. And that makes you feel like a little less solid ground as you evaluate each move and each decision that they make.
Well, also, it behooved Spielman after the fact to say that his decisions were not his own, right? Because he wanted a job with Pittsburgh. He wanted a job somewhere else. And what better way to do that than to say, hey, look, the ups that I made in Minnesota were not actually my ups. I was forced to do them by ownership. And he had absentee ownership that, spends all their time in Jersey and left Spielman to sort of run things because they figured it was all in good hands, which was untrue. And now it feels like it's sort of like a gross overcorrection where they've gone from being absentee owners to being a little more involved than I would prefer. The only thing that gives me hope, though, and this is real, talking yourself into things, is the draft class, because that draft night, that was a shitty draft night, right? They could have gotten a lot of different cool people at 12. Like I was hoping Jameson Williams, somebody like that. And then, at the last second, not only do they move down in the draft, they move all the way down in the draft. And you guys sit there until like I wanted to go to bed. Like I'm not gonna lie. Like I wanted to go to sleep. Instead, I had to wake up I'd stay up another 2 to 3 hours for them to draft Lewis Seen. And like at the time, that was not a very pleasant evening. But now, even with Seen still not having been promoted to the starting lineup yet, I think that the guys that they got, him and Booth, particularly Ingram, and Asamoah and Chandler, like those, it seems like a very, very good draft class. And the how they acquired that draft class, that irritation begins to recede the more that I see Ed Ingram just swallowing guys in preseason games and shit like that.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about as far as your excitement. Now, everybody who follows the team gets very, very tuned up to talk about the offensive line. And you are among the many who can't always quite understand why the starting center is who he is. But the other day, it was said on this very show by an offensive line expert, Brandon Thorne of Trench Warfare, that the Vikings have the bones of an offensive line that could be quite good. And your fascination with it is also kind of amusing to me, but I could see why.
Hey, you're talking down to me.
It's been gone for so long. It's been bad for so long that I can understand why there would be so much obsession over.
Well, the other thing is that, and I don't like pulling this card, but I played offensive line. So I played it for 10 years. And, so when I isolate Ed Ingram and I watch him in preseason games, and granted, you take the preseason with a grain of salt and all that stuff. I see things that, I saw my better teammates doing, right? Like you can see like the technique is there. And also he was dinged going into the draft for having balance issues. I saw no sign of that. That might be different when he has to go up against like Rashawn Gary or somebody like that. But it was a very convincing performance. There's only one performance, and I'm well aware of that. The only place where I do disagree with you is that I don't believe in Garrett Bradbury at all. And I also do believe that they can still actively replace him and improve. Like I'm fully on if you want to sign JC Treader or Matt Skura, I'm totally fine with that, because I don't think you can do worse than Bradbury, because I think Bradbury is a legitimate bust, and I don't think he belongs on the team whatsoever.
So that is a little too aggressive for my taste, I think, because what ends up happening a lot is, and look, I don't think Garrett Bradbury's been anywhere close to good as pass protection. So yeah, there's no disagreement there. The one thing is that with Tom Compton, this is what we dealt with. It's like anybody would be better. And then it was like, oh yeah, have you seen Dakota Dozier? And it's like, I'm not convinced entirely that Chris Reed, just because he's a different person than Garrett Bradbury, will automatically be better. That if it's the same, but he's not as good at the things that Bradbury does well, and you've gone through this entire offseason with Bradbury, you're just going to flip a switch and change the center? Like that's a pretty hard thing to ask. So I think that there's
teams do it. I mean, sometimes they got to switch centers in midseason because of injury. Mason Cole subbed in for Bradbury last season, in the middle of last season, and was better than Bradbury. I wish they had kept Mason Cole instead.
Well, Mason Cole, they wanted to, but he cost too much money, which is a really funny sentence. But that's where we're at. So I'm not saying that I wouldn't take a look at Chris Reed at center with the starters, but the fact that he hasn't been, it's, I think that this team, they had to, or they felt they had to get their own eyes on some players that if they had asked us, maybe we would have said, you don't really actually need to get your eyes on some of these players. And Garrett Bradbury is kind of the most definitive version of that. The question is, if you have better guard play, how much of that can be covered up? And I think the answer is probably a little, because the guard play has been just as abysmal. So even a small improvement to that should make it not as bad as it was.
I agree with you there. And I also think that O'Connell believes to a certain extent that he can scheme his way out of it, because you're talking about an offense that's going to have a lot of misdirection, a lot of motion, a lot of jet sweeps, things like that. And Bradbury, and the nice thing I'll say about him is that he does play well in space, right? Like he's very, he pulls very well. If he, on screen passes, he finds guys very well. Like he can move very well. And that was his positive attribute. But, when you are in a when you're in a 2-minute drill and it is an obvious passing situation and you can't necessarily do a lot of that fancy shit, that's where everything falls apart. And so I'm hesitant, to believe that the situation can't be improved, not by Reed. I'll be with you there. That I'll say Chris Reed. I can't know that Chris Reed's any better, but I do think that it is worth at least bringing in one, low tier free agent to work out just to see, rather than sort of crossing your fingers and hoping that by running like 5 jet sweeps a game, you're going to make Garrett Bradbury more useful than he is, because they've already been trying to make Bradbury happen for 3 years now, and it's failed. So I'm not seeing how a fourth year of it's going to be any different, even with new leadership in place.
Yeah, and if it looked slightly different in training camp, maybe I would give it some more time, but it just hasn't. And once, right. But I will say there is something that comes from this, though, that Kevin O'Connell, it took 4 questions at the podium to kind of get this out of him, but Kevin O'Connell had to acknowledge when he's one-on-one in these past situations, it's just not good. Yeah, and addressing the problem is the first step, but also it's like, okay, they at least are recognizing what's going on here. So O'Connell is evaluating this and seeing that this is going to be an issue. I think that many times you talk about talking yourself into it. I think that the Vikings, whether it was Spielman or Zimmer, talked themselves into a lot of things that just went sideways on them. I mean, go back to like TJ Clemmings. They kept doing that thing over and over. And it was like they had lots of, well, if he only this or he only that. And it's like, what? No, I mean, this is nowhere close. I was going to ask you this regarding Bradbury. As far as Viking players in the recent history who have driven you mad, where does he rank?
Oh God. I don't know, because, when he pisses me off, it was sort of a function of the entire line pissing me off, right? It's hard to separate him from, like you said, the guards surrounding him who were abysmal for years and years and years. And maybe that's better this year, but there's still a non-zero chance that it's not. I think Laquan Treadwell is probably the number one. Like, he was just a deeply annoying player, and I'm glad he's gone. I'm just astounded that he's still in football. Kudos to him for that. But he was a truly shitty player, and I'm glad he's gone. I'm glad he's still making money. Kudos to him and all that stuff. But I couldn't get him off the roster fast enough. The other thing about Bradbury is that, when you have a weak link at center, that is not an enormous problem when you have a mobile quarterback, right? If you have Russell Wilson, big deal. He's going to kick out, and he's going to go, he's going to take the pocket with him, 10 yards to the left, 10 yards to the right. He's going to get behind the protection where the protection is best. And I think you would probably agree with me that Kirk is not all that capable of that. But I do think that there is all the possibility in the world that this coaching staff does not believe that, and that they can succeed by rolling out Kirk on more plays than he has in the past. And I think might end up being a shaky gambit, but I would bet you anything that is something that they attempt if they keep Bradbury in the lineup.
Well, the best offense that they've had, the best that Kirk has ever had, was 2019. And it was a huge priority of Kevin Stefanski to roll out Kirk, because there are things that Kirk does not do well that we focus on a lot. But one thing he does super well is throws it when he's rolling to his left or right. I mean, It's just like, technically he is excellent in making those throws. And I think Stefanski really realized that and moved the pocket quite a bit. I don't think there's any real answer for having one weak link, but they've had 2 or 3 in the past, and there was absolutely no way to scheme around it. So I think that those things, I think every player on the offensive line impacts each other in some way or another. And so having Elflein at guard when he had never played guard since college and things like that, I think there was a lot of other factors that went into how much impact it actually made.
That to me was really tragic, because he was so good his rookie year as a center. I was like, oh my God, I don't have to worry about this position for like the next 10 years. We are next Jeff Christie. That was not true.
We thought the same thing. I mean, honestly, we were talking about should we be writing about Garrett Bradbury Rookie of the Year, or not Garrett Bradbury, Pat Elflein Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, he was that good.
Yeah, and really it never came back. Nope. After he had that injury in the NFC Championship game. And probably just, part of being undersized is You play a dangerous game as an offensive lineman. Like, you can't lose 1% if you're that guy. Okay, so tell me before we wrap this up, because I have a bigger question for you to wrap it up. But just what do you want to know? What else do you want to know? Do you want to know anything? You're sending me messages. What do you think of this guy? I like this guy. What do you want to know? We're here together.
It goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and I think you already sort of answered it, which was, who's really in charge here. I think that they're still sorting that out, but I'd like to know from you if you have a sense. Do you believe that eventually Kwesi will be allowed to take command of this franchise and shape it in his image?
I don't. I mean, I don't think that as far as, so here's an interesting like thought experiment is, instead of doing collaboration, putting just this one smart guy in charge and seeing what happens. Like, okay, well, this guy's got a lot of answers, like have him call all the shots based on what everybody thinks, the scouts and so forth, as opposed to collaboration of, we have Kwesi, but it's more like the chairman with all of the other chair people making these shots, and then it's
right.
The ownership having
it makes sense if it's Kwesi and O'Connell running things like as a tandem. And I liked what he said about collaboration in terms of between coaches and players. Like, I think that's the correct and modern approach. And I know like guys like old fossils like Pat Royce are like harumph, Bud Grant, harumph, whatever. Like that doesn't really, none of that really bothers me, and it doesn't strike me as buzzwords. It strikes me as legit. But you are correct where it still needs to be top down. And so, it's collaboration strikes me as an approach to leadership, but I need to know the leaders are still allowed to lead. And that's where I'm concerned, because, I feel like the Wilfs are meddling a touch here, and I'm hoping that they take their hands off as soon as they feel like Kwesi sort of has everything handled. But, they're rich dunces from New Jersey. I don't know that they'll ever feel that way or not.
Well, so Zach Lowe said something on his podcast once that I found to be very insightful, is like, a lot of GM's best skill has to be selling ownership on the right things that they should be thinking.
Yeah, it's true.
With Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, he just met them. And this was his only team that was really interested in hiring him as a GM. So you have to kind of be like, yes, okay, well, let's try that. We'll do our best with what you're asking us to do for the start. But then as you get them to know you better and know your ideas better and know your direction better, can you sell them? And this is not about selling them on a tank. It's selling them on doing the right things, basically with the quarterback position and with the roster as a whole, to transition it from having the older stars to having the next wave of good players surrounded by a quarterback that's hitting on Justin Jefferson the right time before he's super expensive. Like, it's a tough needle to thread. But if Kwesi cannot sell them on these things, then he has not done what he needed to do here, right? Like, there are some owners.
Yeah, it's its own skill.
Right. There's some owners you can't sell. Like, what are you going to sell? Daniel Snyder? Like, the guy's going to do whatever he wants. I think these are reasonable people, though.
I do. I mean, if they weren't reasonable, I don't think they would have hired Kwesi to begin with, right? And I've never really had a beef with the Wilfs as owners, particularly in terms of how they spend. They've always been willing to spend, right? And the team has been to 2 NFC title games under their ownership. I don't have much complaints about. It's much better than being owned by like Stephen Ross or something like that, right? So these are mild owner complaints. These are first world owner complaints. But you're right that, Kwesi has to be able to, convince them that they hired him for the reasons that they hired him. And I don't know, I can't know that dynamic at all. And I'm not even sure Kwesi knows what that dynamic is just yet. And I think, this season's going to go a long way to deciding how that's going to happen. And, I have to have hope that something good will come out of it, and that Kirk won't be here a year from now. But I hoped for the same thing this offseason, and that didn't happen.
Okay, last thing, since we opened by saying you talk yourself into stuff,
right?
Here's your challenge. I want you to talk yourself and the audience and me into 9-8 being a good season.
Oh yeah, no, I think that would be a good season, because like I said, I don't like, regardless of sort of the long-term benefit, I don't like I don't like enduring a season where you're genuinely, truly awful and unwatchable. Like I don't like that. I know last year's 8-9 team was no fun to watch at all either. But I think if they're 9-8, which I think they will probably be, like I think they will be an 8 or 9 win team that has far more bright spots and is more pleasant to watch this year than they were last year. So you'll get the same result, but it'll be a more pleasant sort of journey toward that result. And I won't have much of a complaint about that because it will prove that that O'Connell is competent and can win games even with a core that he inherited and probably on a deep level doesn't particularly want at the moment. And and it proves that they can make hay with sort of a roster that was all but forced upon them. So I don't have a problem with that because then it would give the Wilfs confidence maybe to loosen the rein a bit and give them a bit more power over the organization. And plus I like winning games. Like if they beat Green Bay twice out of those 9 games, that sounds very Washington of me, but that's nice. I like that. I like it when they beat the teams I want them to beat. Like I like a few good wins here and there. It's nice.
Well, I think that if Kevin O'Connell proves clever on the offensive side and like he really knows what he's doing as a head coach, game management, you mentioned that even if you lost games because your roster wasn't quite strong enough, the whole process, like it would be right. Like, look, he's running the offensive things you should be running. He's managing the game the way you should be managing. He's managing the players the way you should be managing the players. That's going to work long term. Your roster just wasn't good enough. That's to me the biggest thing you're trying to find out if it's a 9-8 season and why it could be a success, even if that's the case. Even though on the show we do have the edict to talk about Super Bowls and that's it. But I think that you could come away feeling like this was not a disaster of a transition season if you find out that your head coach knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean that matters more than anything else, right? If you have the right GM and you have the right head coach, you're 2/3 of the way there. Like. That's great. Like if I don't have to worry about those positions for the next decade and I only got a sweat quarterback, which I will, I'll feel better about that. I'll feel much better about that than I certainly did a year ago.
Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I'm glad we could get together. Allow me to say some nice things. That your support of Purple Insider has been very meaningful to me because you have long been one of my favorite writers. So when you said that you were reading my work, I thought this is awesome and also made me very nervous because I am not on your level of writing, but your work, why your team sucks. I read every single one of them and people should too. And the Defector, man, it's just like as a person who went off on his own away from big business to see the Defector doing as well as it is, bringing on Kalen Kaler, who's absolutely fantastic. I just love to see it. And like you're alive still, which is like a major part. Yeah, and you made content out of it. Like you also wrote a book.
That's right, I got a book.
Yeah, how about that? So all good things.
Well, thank you for having me on. And I love the newsletter. I read it every time it comes out. It's my number one appointment reading. So thank you so much for putting it out, and thanks for having me on.
Yep, thanks for doing it, man. And we'll talk again soon.
All right, see you, brother.